Good morning, Calvary Hill Church. Thanks so much for tuning in to our Calvary Hill home church today. I just want to take a couple moments and say, first of all, thank you for all of your prayers for Pastor Brandon and Anna. They are home. They will not be with us this Sunday as they're still quarantining to make sure that they're all good and ready to be back next Sunday with us as a church family. And we're excited for that. And I know you guys are excited to see them as well. And so thank you again just for keeping them in prayer as they're still transitioning and helping his dad figure out next steps and how they move forward as a family. So thank you again for praying for them. Today I'm excited to share with you the title of this message, if you had to give it one, even though we're kind of doing a little bit of our Thanksgiving sermon today. Faithful Despite. And we're going to be talking out of Daniel chapter 6. And before I do, I just want to mention, I think if we're honest, I'm sure we would all say that 2020 has been a little bit of a different year than what we've initially planned, right? I think if we were all honest, we can look back at what we had as our New Year's resolutions, and we kind of look and think, wow, I was so naive to what 2020 would truly end up looking like. And if you took just a few moments and you tried to recap what 2020 has been for you so far, just take, three things that stood out to you. What would be those top three things for you? Oftentimes for most of us, that list would probably be full of more negative things, especially like a year 2020 has been, than it would positive things. And I think that's just important for us to be mindful of. I think so often it's just easier for us to focus on some of the bad things that have happened, especially in a year like 2020 has been. And some of you, this has been the best year you've ever had, and I'm so glad to hear that. And others, this has been the toughest year of your life. And I don't want to ever downplay either side of that. But I think it's important for us just to be aware, what has this year looked like? How would you define it? There's just a short story that talks about footprints in the sand, and it shares about a guy who's talking to God. God, why is it sometimes I look back and I only see one set of footprints in the sand? And I kind of like how this image kind of displays it, and it says, when you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. Right? Those moments where you only see one set of footprints, that's when God, he was the one who was carrying us through whatever that difficult season might have been. And I had seen this comic that I still just love, and it says this here. It says, my child, I never left you. Those places with one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. And that long groove over there is when I dragged you for a while. And if we're being honest, 2020, there have been some moments where it's felt like God has just been dragging us to the finish line. And I think it's so easy for us to get caught up in how the struggles can just become so real. And I hope and I pray that we can change that perspective a little bit today. I want us to talk about a man named Daniel. Daniel, he lived around 600 BC. It was right in the time of the Babylonians, and they were kind of taking over everything. And matter of fact, if you have been a Christian for a while, you know some Bible stories. You probably remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they were thrown in the fiery furnace. Daniel was actually there around that same time, and he was the one who recorded that story that we have today in the Bible. I want us to focus on Daniel chapter 6. And at this point, Darius is the current king over all of Babylon, and Daniel is actually a trusted advisor to the king. He's kind of a really important guy at this point, and we know that he had to have come from some sort of, you could say, royalty because of the opportunity he even had to be in that position. You had to be well learned and well liked to be able to even get a seat at that table. And so just the fact that he had that opportunity is just important perspective to have. And so I want us today, we're going to spend a few minutes just reading through this story of Daniel chapter 6, and hopefully we can pick up some key points from it. So in Daniel chapter 6, starting with verse 1, it says this: it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. Now, satraps, they were kind of the governors of the Persian Empire. So he takes 120 of these guys, puts them over all of the Persian Empire, and they're the ones who are kind of governing all of the actions that they're supposed to take. And in verse 2, it goes on. And it says, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. So here we see Daniel, he's one of the top 3 guys at this point. In the group of 120, he's seen as top 3 here. And the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So Daniel's job is to make sure that the governors are doing their job, the satraps are doing their job, so that the king is not losing anything, whether that's people or finances or some person's coming over to take over. He's making sure, Daniel's job is to make sure that King Darius stays in power. That's his job. So we see in verse 3 it says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So he's looked at as, he can't help but distinguish himself as being somebody of good character, somebody with great qualities. Now that's important to realize, is Daniel couldn't help but do the right things. And you know just as well as I, sometimes we dislike the people who do the right thing only because they do the right thing. Why can't they be like the rest of us and just mess up sometimes? You know, you're just waiting and watching and like, oh, okay, good, they're normal, right? That's Daniel is looked at as like, he's just not like the others. How important that is to be said about us. Now, in verse 4, it goes on and it says, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so." They could not find anything that he would do wrong. And it keeps going. It says, "They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent." I think of this description of just how they couldn't find anything wrong. No matter how hard they tried, he just kept doing the right things. And it got under their skin. It bothered them so much that they wanted to get rid of him. Have you ever had that kid in class? You know, the kid who, he was the one reminding the teacher that we had homework the night before because he had done it, right? He was that kid. Daniel was that kid. He was just so excited to do the right thing. And everybody else is saying, come on, seriously, you got to mess this up for the rest of us every time, right? And so Daniel, he's doing the right thing every single time. Nobody's really happy about it. It goes on in verse 5 and it says, "Finally, these men said, 'We will never find any bias for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" So they're trying to find a way. How do we trap him? Well, the only thing that we could do is set him up. And the only thing we can really set him up with is his love for God. It's just important to understand the backstory of Daniel's life. People were so frustrated with how much he loved God, how faithful he was to God, and how faithful he was to doing the right thing again and again and again. And so here we see they became so jealous that they wanted to find a way to trap him, to get rid of him by any means necessary. So it goes on in verse 6, it says this, "So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, 'May King Darius live forever.'" Right there, he's sticking that in there. Hey, we care so much about you being the king, right? We want you to live forever, your name to live on, right? And they do this by how? The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. Meaning we all got together, we all discussed, and we've all come to this conclusion. There's only one problem with this. Where's Daniel? Do you really think Daniel would have signed up for what they're about to say? Let's keep reading. It says, "They've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree." Now, listen closely to what this decree is. It says that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now this is a little bit of a problem because Daniel, he worships God. I don't think that Daniel would have actually agreed to this kind of an edict. But they presented it as this thing that, hey, we've all agreed that your name is worthy to be praised above every other name. And they're kind of just feeding into King Darius' ego at this point. They're trying to convince him that, hey, you're kind of a big deal. And we want everybody for the next 30 days to acknowledge how big of a deal you are. Once again, it just goes to the importance of the people you have around you speaking into your life. And so King Darius, he's kind of liking this idea a lot. In verse 8 it says, "Now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, so nobody can change it. Once we've gotten this down, we don't want anybody to try and sway you, right? And it says, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So they're saying, hey, put this in so that nobody can ever change it. In verse 9, it says, so King Darius put the decree in writing. He loved the idea. And this is drawn up to intentionally trap Daniel, because they already knew if this decree came out, Daniel's love for God was far too great. He would not stop worshiping God. They knew that going in. And so in verse 10, it says, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he has done before. And I think this is important to notice. Daniel, he reads the decree, and immediately all he does is live his life like normal. Man, I think this is just so important to realize, and I highlighted this for a reason. It says, just as he had done before. Meaning this, Daniel did not go into his basement and hide the fact that he was praying. Nor did he go out into the middle of the street and publicly proclaim, hey guys, I'm about to pray to God. I'm making sure you realize this guy over here, not praying to King Darius. Just want you to be aware that I'm going to do this. What it's saying is Daniel was doing exactly what he had been doing already. I think it's so important for us to realize if you are not living that life of faith up until problems come, it's going to be challenging for you to stay faithful. Here, Daniel, he had always been doing this. Was just a part of his life. So be careful not to use your podium of Christianity as an opportunity to live out your faith in a way that you've never really done before. It's called being fake. See, just as he had always done, that's how he prayed. Just as he had always done. You know, I think about how there are times in my life when problems come, right? You know, I put my van in the shop about a month ago, and 2 weeks after I put my van in the shop, I've got, you know, the check engine light comes on and the tire pressure light come on, and I'm thinking these tires are brand new. I can't already have a problem, and I just had this van in the shop. And the moment that those lights came on, what happened? My world felt like it ended. And I got so frustrated, right? I became so annoyed. Just another issue. But how important it is. Daniel, he read what just came out, and it was as if he was unfazed. He said, I'm going to worship God just like I've always done. How important it is to make sure that we live that life of faith day in and day out. So when the problems come, we're prepared. We're prepared and ready to honor God. Stay faithful. So going on in verse 11, it says, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So now they've got him exactly where they want. Verse 13, it goes on and it says, then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, right? They don't say one of your trusted advisors. They don't say one of your favorite people. They define him as one of those exiles. One of those people you don't even really need, right? He pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Man, I remember growing up with my brothers, when somebody else was doing something wrong, how quick were we to run and tell mom? Because we loved getting them into trouble, right? My older brother, he's threatening our lives as we're running to tell mom. My younger brother, he's like snitching on everything we've ever done wrong in our entire lives. You know, hey, remember that one time somebody stuck something in the outlet that actually wasn't me? It was actually him, right? I mean, he's just telling every dirty secret we've ever had, right? This is that moment. Here, these guys, they were so excited to finally catch him. In verse 14, it goes on and says, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. Remember, Daniel was somebody that he truly cared about. Ready to hand over the kingdom to him at this point. He's greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. The point of that until sundown, they had a full day to make sure that that edict was filled out. After that had been published, by the end of that day, Daniel had to be thrown into the lion's den. There was no other option. And they knew that going in. And so King Darius tried everything he could to save him, but it just couldn't happen. And so in verse 15 it says, "Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, 'Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed.'" They're like, "Hey, you can't back out now. If you back out of this, they're going to question every law you've ever put in place. So you've got to hold firm. You have no choice." In verse 16 it goes on, it says, "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.'" Here, King Darius doesn't even really believe in his God, and he says, "Listen, I hope it was worth it, and I hope he protects you. That same God you've been serving throughout your whole life, I hope he comes through for you." So in verse 17, it says that a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. So that's important to realize. The reason why they did that was so that ring stamp there means no one else can open this. So they wanted to make sure that he was sealed and nobody could go in and save him. That the king or no one else could go in and try and pull him out. So he was there. He had to be there all night. In verse 18 it says, "Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep." King Darius, he was so concerned about Daniel. In verse 19 it says, "At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lions, and he was so nervous to see what had happened. He just could not wait. So the first light, he got down, he got out there and went for it." In verse 20 it says, "When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?'" Here he's asking, "Daniel, are you in there? Are you okay? What's going on?" In verse 21 it says, "Daniel answered, 'May the king live forever.'" Just imagine that moment when King Darius heard those words, the amount of excitement that he must have experienced as soon as he heard Daniel's voice. It goes on, it says, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." So here, he's just laying it on thick. Look, I've never done anything wrong. Here's the proof. I'm alive. And God has seen fit to save me. And I can only imagine the look on the advisor's face at this point as they heard his voice and they begin to know, oh boy, we're caught. Now we've messed up. They didn't expect this to happen. And so in verse 23 it says, "The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God." And the rest of this chapter, it kind of finishes out. It says that those same advisors and their entire families were thrown into that same pit. And they did not have the same fate as Daniel. And King Darius ends up talking about how incredible this God that Daniel serves is, so much so he sent a new edict, a new law, saying that everyone is to worship the God of Daniel. We see that Daniel prospered during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I think it's so important we see Daniel staying faithful to God, and God protected him. The reality is, so many of us, we want God to protect us before we ever even get to the pit. Matter of fact, we don't even want the pit to be an option for us. Yet Daniel, he chose to be faithful, and because of it, he prospered. How important it is for us to make sure that we stay faithful to God, despite our circumstances, despite what we might be going through in the moment. No matter what he faced, Daniel chose to be faithful. And I think it's so important that we learn to trust God in that same way. That we learn to trust in God no matter what we might face. You see, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 touches on this. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. It says, trust in God with all your heart. Even in those moments when I'm just not sure if I'm ready to trust him, trust in him. Daniel chose to trust in God, even in the pit. Man, I pray that we learn to have that same kind of faith. Faith in God that he will keep us safe, despite what we're going through. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. It should not be based on whether or not I understand. Daniel, he did not understand what was going to happen once he got in that pit, but he trusted in God anyways. In verse 6, it goes on and it says, in all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. No matter what we encounter, lean on him. Submit to him. And he will be the one who makes your path straight. See, I think it's important to realize God said he would make our path straight. He didn't say that there wouldn't be any bumps in the road. So despite your circumstances, are you willing to trust in God? Are you willing to remain faithful? I love this quote by Ron Edmondson, and it says, we need to realize that even when we are right in the middle of God's will, we can still face adversity. Despite what 2020 has looked like for you, you could be right in the middle of God's will and still face adversity. I think it's so important for us to realize, no matter what we're going through, God is still right there with us. And God is still walking with us. And he cares for us. Will you choose to be faithful, even when it doesn't make sense? You know, I remember when I graduated from college, I remember just finding out just how much student loan debt I was in. And I remember I sat down with one of my college professors, and he and I were just discussing, and I was telling him I have no idea how I'm going to find a job that will pay me enough money so that I can care for my wife and my children one day. At that time, I was just a broke college student with no idea of what life would look like. Now I look and I see how God has been faithful. I'm so grateful that I chose to be faithful to God and how he provided. And I'll never forget what my college professor said. He said, God brought you to this college, and so he will provide a way for you to pay for it. And that has stuck with me. Dr. Mark McLean, when he said that to me, man, it stuck with me. If I choose to be faithful to God, then he will provide for me. And now looking back, I'm still paying for my college, but I continue to see the faithfulness of God. At every single turn, God has been faithful. So stay faithful to God, and he will provide. You see, Daniel could have easily let his situation stop him from seeing God's provision. It would have been so easy for him to get lost in the circumstances he was facing and say, I just don't know if, God, this is really what you want from me. But instead, he chose to be faithful. You know, if we do anything this Thanksgiving season, when you sit down at the table, my hope and my prayer is that we would choose to be thankful in the midst of whatever we're walking through. Whatever your situation might look like. My hope and my prayer is that we would choose to be thankful despite our mess. And we would choose to be faithful to God no matter the outcome. A couple of action steps, and we'll be done here in just a few moments. And this first action step here is, how have you lost perspective because of your circumstances this year? What happened to you in 2020 that made you lose focus, made you lose perspective? You see, Daniel didn't allow his circumstances change his perspective. He didn't allow what was happening to him in the moment, because it would have been easy while he was in his room praying to God to lose perspective in just the way he prayed. But that's not what we see. Make sure that your current perspective does not change based on your circumstances. How has that happened to you this year? Identify those things that may have pulled you off course. The second thing here is, how has God used you in the midst of your circumstances? Evaluate, what has 2020 looked like? How has God still been able to use you despite the mess? Maybe it was an opportunity to talk to a neighbor in a way that you've never been able to. Maybe it was to provide groceries for a friend who was locked in quarantine. How has God been able to use you this year? My hope is we don't miss our opportunity to make a difference in somebody else's life. My prayer is just like Daniel, that you would choose to be faithful in whatever circumstances you're about to face. There's only a month and a half left in 2020. Make sure that our perspective does not get lost and that we choose to be faithful despite whatever comes our way. Calvary Hill Church, we're praying for you. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you again soon.